The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the girl outside Russell Kane's bakery still dripped like something pulled from deep water. Her clothes, once fine cotton, now shredded and mud-stained, clung to a frame too thin for 18. Yet her spine remained unnaturally straight, shoulders squared despite trembling, chin level despite begging. "Excuse me," the words fractured, barely audible. "Do you have any expired cake?" It wasn't the question that made Russell freeze. It was the way she bowed her head, a slow, measured tilt, angled precisely as if practiced 1,000 times before a mirror, the kind of greeting taught to girls who must maintain dignity even while begging. Her hands gripped the torn bag strap, nails broken and blackened, but fingers strangely long and delicate, not those of someone who'd worked with their hands. Behind her, a black sedan drifted past. She went rigid but didn't run, just stood trembling, waiting to see if this stranger would give her expired cake or recognize what she was really begging for. What nightmare turns aristocracy into someone begging for garbage in the rain? Russell had spent 8 years running the bakery on Maple Street, 8 years of 4 a.m. starts and flour under his fingernails and the persistent smell of yeast that never quite washed out of his clothes. The work had saved him after Carol died, given him something to do with his hands when grief made it impossible to think straight, provided a reason to get out of bed when their daughter Zoe needed a parent who could function. He'd seen his share of people down on their luck. This neighborhood attracted them, the way struggling places always did. But something about this girl stopped him cold. She stood at his door like a contradiction, every line of her body screaming expensive education and careful breeding, while her clothes told a story of weeks spent sleeping rough. He opened the door, keeping himself positioned in the frame, like a barrier between her and Zoe, who was somewhere in the back doing homework. "We're closed," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. The bakery was closed, sure, but he wasn't sending this girl away. Not when she looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. Not when her hands shook like that. Not when she'd asked her question with the kind of careful pronunciation that spoke of language tutors and finishing schools. "Please," she said, and the word came out broken. "I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. Just anything expired, anything you were going to throw away." Russell disappeared into the bakery without answering, leaving her standing on the threshold. He could feel her tension through the door, the way she was probably calculating whether to run, whether this was a trap, whether she'd made a mistake by speaking to him at all. He filled a bag with everything he could grab: day-old croissants, the heel ends of sourdough loaves, 3 chocolate chip cookies that were too dark around the edges to sell, a ham sandwich he'd made for his own dinner, but suddenly couldn't imagine eating. When he came back, she was exactly where he'd left her, frozen in place like a deer caught in headlights. He held out the bag, and she took it with both hands, cradling it against her chest like it contained something precious. "Thank you," she whispered, and tears cut clean tracks through the dirt on her face. She didn't wipe them away, just stood there, crying silently while clutching a bag of baked goods Russell had been planning to throw out anyway. He wanted to ask questions: who she was, what had happened to her, why a girl who moved like minor royalty was begging for food outside his bakery. But something in her face told him she wouldn't answer, couldn't answer, that whatever story had brought her here was still too raw to speak aloud. So he just nodded, watching her walk away into the gathering dusk, with her spine still impossibly straight, despite everything, and wondered what kind of world created situations like this. Inside the bakery, Zoe looked up from her math homework with those big brown eyes that had come straight from her mother. "Who was that?" his daughter asked, her voice carrying that particular note of curiosity that meant she'd been watching through the window, cataloging details the way 8-year-olds did when they sensed something important was happening. Russell wiped flour from his hands, buying time to figure out how to answer. "Just someone who needed food," he said finally, and Zoe frowned, processing this. She looked sad, Zoe announced with the kind of blunt honesty that children specialized in. Like maybe she doesn't have a home. Russell couldn't argue with that assessment, so he didn't try. The girl came back 3 days later, appearing during the afternoon lull when the lunch rush had ended and the after-school crowd hadn't yet arrived. Russell was teaching Zoe how to portion cookie dough when he glanced up and saw her standing outside the window, soaked through despite the clear sky. She must have washed in a public restroom or maybe a park fountain, because her clothes looked cleaner. But she was still painfully thin, still carrying that same battered bag like it held everything she owned. Zoe saw her at the same moment, dropping her ice cream scoop with a clatter that made Russell jump. "Daddy, it's the sad girl. Why is she all wet?" Russell had no good answer for that question. He walked to the door, with Zoe trailing behind him, pulled it open, and stepped aside without making the girl ask. She entered slowly, carefully, her eyes taking in everything like she was cataloging exits, or maybe just trying to remember what the inside of a warm building felt like. "I'm Zoe," his daughter announced, before Russell could say anything. "That's my daddy. What's your name?" The girl's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile under different circumstances. "Iris," she said quietly, and Russell heard the lie in it immediately, heard the way she'd chosen a name that meant nothing, that couldn't be traced back to wherever she'd come from. "Are you hungry?" Russell asked, even though the answer was obvious from the way her eyes kept drifting toward the display case. Iris nodded once, a sharp movement like she was ashamed to admit it, and Russell felt something in his chest crack open. "Zoe, can you get Iris a chair?" His daughter scrambled to comply, dragging one of the cafe chairs over, with the kind of determined efficiency that made Russell's heart ache with love for her. Iris sat down like her legs might give out if she didn't, and Russell brought her a plate loaded with fresh bread, a bowl of soup left over from his own lunch, and a glass of milk that Zoe insisted on pouring herself. They watched Iris eat, Russell trying not to be obvious about it, while Zoe stared with the unapologetic directness of childhood. The girl ate slowly at first, like she was trying to pace herself, but gradually the hunger won out, and she started taking larger bites, faster, until Russell had to gently remind her to slow down, or she'd make herself sick. When she finished, she looked at the empty plate with something like surprise, as if she couldn't quite believe she'd eaten it all. "Thank you," she said again, that same careful pronunciation from before. And Russell waved it away like it was nothing, even though they both knew it wasn't. "Do you need work?" The question came out of Russell's mouth before he'd fully thought it through, but once it was out there, he committed to it. "Morning shift, 4:30 to 9, basic prep work, portioning dough, shaping loaves, that kind of thing. I can pay $40 a day, cash." It was more than he could afford, more than the work was probably worth, given that he'd been managing fine on his own. But something about Iris made him want to help in a way that went beyond just feeding her. Maybe it was the way she held herself, that careful dignity despite her circumstances. Maybe it was how Zoe was looking at her, like she'd already decided this stranger was worth protecting. Iris stared at him like he'd just offered her the moon. "I don't have an address," she said quietly, and Russell heard all the things she wasn't saying. No ID, no references, no way to prove she was who she claimed to be, because she was claiming to be nobody at all. "Don't need an address," Russell replied, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. "Just need someone who shows up on time and works hard. Can you do that?" Iris nodded so hard her whole body moved, and Russell felt like he'd just stepped off a cliff into something he didn't fully understand, but couldn't back away from now. "Tomorrow morning, then. 4:30. Back door." He watched her stand up, watched her bow slightly in that same precisely angled way from before, and wondered what he'd just gotten himself into. Iris showed up the next morning at 4:27, standing in the pre-dawn darkness like a ghost, waiting for permission to exist. She wore the same clothes, still damp, Russell noticed, which meant she probably didn't have anywhere dry to sleep. But her hair was pulled back in a neat braid, and her face was scrubbed clean. Russell let her in without comment, handed her an apron that was too big for her thin frame, and showed her how to measure flour, how to check the yeast bloom, how to shape baguettes with the heel of her hand. She absorbed everything with an intensity that bordered on desperate, her hands moving quickly and surely, making mistakes, but learning from them immediately in a way that told Russell she was used to being taught, used to meeting high standards. They worked in silence for the first hour. The only sounds the whir of the industrial mixer and the quiet thump of dough hitting the work surface. Russell found himself watching Iris out of the corner of his eye, noting the way she moved through the kitchen like someone who'd spent time in professional spaces before, the way she instinctively knew to stay out of his way when he was pulling things from the oven, the way she organized her workspace with a precision that spoke of training. When 9 o'clock came and he told her she could go, she looked almost disappointed, like she wanted to stay in this warm place that smelled like bread and offered the illusion of safety. Russell handed her an envelope with $40 and watched her eyes go wide. "This is too much," she said, trying to hand it back, but Russell closed her fingers around it. "It's what the job pays. Come back tomorrow, same time." Iris clutched the envelope like it might disappear if she didn't hold on tight enough, and Russell saw the moment when she decided to trust this, to believe that maybe she'd found something stable in the chaos of whatever was happening to her. She thanked him 3 times before leaving through the back door, and Russell stood in his empty bakery, wondering what story had brought a girl like that to his door. The pattern held for 2 weeks. Iris showed up every morning at 4:27, worked with that same desperate intensity, and left at 9 with her $40 clutched in scarred hands. She never asked for more hours, never complained about the early starts or the hard physical labor, never offered any information about where she went when she left the bakery. Russell didn't push, sensing that whatever fragile trust they'd built would shatter if he demanded answers she wasn't ready to give. But he noticed things, the way she flinched at loud noises, the way her eyes tracked every car that passed the front window, the way she ate the food he sent home with her, like she might never eat again. Zoe started appearing at the bakery after school, settling herself at the work table with her homework while Iris finished the afternoon prep. Russell watched his daughter try to draw Iris out with questions about her favorite color, her favorite animal, whether she'd ever seen the ocean. Iris answered carefully, revealing nothing real, but gradually, Russell noticed her starting to relax around Zoe in a way she didn't around adults. Something about his daughter's uncomplicated affection was breaking through Iris's careful walls, making her smile occasionally, even laugh once, when Zoe told a truly terrible knock-knock joke that Carol used to love. Then one afternoon, Zoe asked Iris for help with her Spanish homework, and Iris switched languages mid-sentence without thinking, explaining the difference between sur and estar in flawless Castilian Spanish before catching herself and switching back to English. Zoe's eyes went wide with delight. "You speak Spanish! Can you teach me? My teacher says I sound like a robot." Iris glanced at Russell, asking permission without words, and he nodded even as questions multiplied in his mind. Over the next few days, Iris taught Zoe basic phrases, correcting her pronunciation with the patience of someone who'd been well-educated. And Russell listened while he worked, cataloging all the ways Iris didn't fit the profile of a typical homeless teenager. The first real crack in the facade came on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week. Russell arrived at the bakery to find Iris already there, pressed flat against the back wall in the pre-dawn darkness, her breathing shallow and quick. A black sedan with tinted windows was idling at the end of the alley, engine running, just sitting there like a predator waiting for prey. Russell stood next to Iris without speaking, his presence a silent promise. And after 5 minutes that felt like hours, the sedan pulled away. Iris sagged against the wall, her careful posture finally breaking, and Russell saw how close to the edge she really was. "Who are they?" Russell asked quietly, and Iris shook her head, pulling control back over her face like armor. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't tie her apron, and Russell did it for her without asking, his flour-dusted fingers gentle with the strings. "I can't tell you," she whispered, and Russell heard the fear underneath the words, heard the certainty that telling him would somehow make things worse. "If I tell you, you'll make me leave, and I don't have anywhere else to go." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest, in a way nothing else had been. "I'm not going to make you leave," Russell said, surprised by how much he meant it. "But I can't help you if I don't know what we're dealing with." Iris looked up at him with eyes that had seen things no 18-year-old should see, and Russell felt anger bloom hot in his chest. Someone had hurt this girl, was still trying to hurt her, and she'd been handling it alone because she didn't think anyone would help her. "My real name isn't Iris," she said finally, the words coming out like a confession. "It's Rebecca. Rebecca Ashford." The name hit Russell like a physical blow. Charles Ashford. Everyone in the city knew that name. Billionaire real estate developer. The man who'd built half the downtown skyline, whose death 3 months ago had dominated news cycles for weeks. They'd called it a tragic accident, brake failure on a mountain road, an investigation that concluded there was nothing suspicious about a man losing control of his car on a treacherous curve. But Rebecca's voice held certainty when she said, "Someone killed my father, and now they're trying to kill me too." She told him everything then, the words tumbling out like she'd been holding them in too long. Her father's death that wasn't an accident. Her uncle Vincent, who'd been named executor of the estate until Rebecca turned 21, who decided 3 years was too long to wait for the billion-dollar fortune that should have been his. The night 2 weeks after the funeral, when she'd woken up in the back of a car with zip ties cutting into her wrists, Vincent's men talking casually about where to dump her body where it wouldn't be found. How she'd gotten the door open at a red light and run, leaving behind everything she'd ever known because staying meant dying. "I went to the police," Rebecca said, her voice flat. "First week after I escaped, walked into a station, told them everything. The detective made one phone call. And 6 hours later, Vincent's men showed up at the shelter where I was staying. So I ran again, changed my name, cut my hair, threw away anything that could connect me to the Ashfords. I've been hiding for 3 months, trying to stay alive until I turn 21 and can claim the inheritance legally. Just 3 more years. I only need to survive 3 more years." Russell processed this information while his hands automatically shaped bread dough, the familiar motions grounding him while his mind spun through implications. This girl, this 18-year-old who'd shown up at his bakery begging for expired cake, was supposed to inherit one of the largest fortunes in the city, and the man tasked with protecting her was actively trying to murder her for it. It was the kind of story that belonged in movies, not in the back alley of a struggling bakery, but the bruises on Rebecca's arms were real. The fear in her eyes was real. The way she flinched at every unexpected sound was real. "Why didn't you go to the FBI or a lawyer or—" Russell started. But Rebecca cut him off with a bitter laugh. "Vincent owns enough people that it doesn't matter. He's had 30 years to build relationships, to put people in his debt, to create a network that protects him. I'm just one girl with no proof, no evidence, no way to make anyone believe me over him. The official story is that I'm grieving, possibly mentally unstable, that I ran away because I couldn't handle losing my father. Vincent's been very public about being worried about me, about wanting to get me help. The way she said help made it clear what kind of help Vincent had in mind. Russell pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found the one he needed. "I have a friend, Patricia. She's a lawyer, retired now, but still connected. If anyone can figure out a legal angle here, it's her." Rebecca looked at him like he'd just offered her something impossible, and maybe he had. Trust was a luxury when you'd spent 3 months running for your life, when everyone who was supposed to protect you had either failed or actively tried to hurt you. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, and Russell didn't have a good answer beyond the truth. "Because you need help, and because it's the right thing to do." Patricia answered on the second ring, and Russell explained the situation in careful terms, while Rebecca stood frozen in place, listening to him describe her nightmare to a stranger. When he finished, Patricia was silent for a long moment before saying, "Bring her to my office tomorrow at 2. If what you're telling me is accurate, we need to move fast." Russell hung up and looked at Rebecca, who was crying again, silent tears that she didn't bother to hide. "We're going to figure this out," he told her, hoping he wasn't making promises he couldn't keep. "You're not alone anymore." When Zoe arrived that afternoon, she took one look at Rebecca's face and knew something had changed. Russell watched his daughter walk straight to Rebecca and wrap her arms around her waist, holding on with the kind of fierce loyalty that made his throat tight. Rebecca froze for a second, then slowly brought her arms up to return the hug, and Russell saw something crack in her expression, grief and gratitude and fear all tangled together in a way that looked like it hurt. "It's going to be okay," Zoe said with absolute certainty. "My daddy fixes things." Russell wished desperately that his daughter's confidence was justified, that this was something he could actually fix. The meeting with Patricia was harder than Russell expected. Rebecca had to tell her story again, this time with all the details, the exact timeline of her father's death, the nature of Vincent's threats, the names of the men who'd tried to kidnap her, the police detective who'd betrayed her to Vincent within hours of her statement. Patricia took notes with the grim efficiency of someone who'd heard too many variations of this story, and when Rebecca finished, the lawyer leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "This is bad," she said bluntly. "Vincent Ashford has resources most people can't even imagine, and if he's already proven he's willing to kill to get what he wants, you're in serious danger." Rebecca flinched at the word kill, and Russell reached over to squeeze her shoulder, grounding her in the present moment. Patricia continued, "But you have something he doesn't. You have time. 3 years until you turn 21. That's 3 years for us to build a case, to gather evidence, to create a paper trail that makes you too visible to disappear quietly. We go public with your story, announce that you're alive and aware of threats against your life, make it clear that your death would trigger investigations Vincent can't control. We make you radioactive, too dangerous to kill because the consequences would be too high." "What if he decides I'm worth the risk?" Rebecca asked, her voice small, and Patricia's smile was sharp as a knife. "Then we make sure there are people watching, law enforcement who aren't on his payroll, media contacts who would love a story about a corrupt executor trying to murder his niece, legal safeguards that automatically trigger reviews of his finances if anything happens to you. We bury him in consequences before he even makes a move." It wasn't a perfect plan. Rebecca would still be in danger, still need to be careful. But it was something, a path forward, that didn't involve running forever. They left Patricia's office with a timeline, 2 weeks to gather evidence, compile documentation, build a case strong enough that going public would actually provide protection rather than just painting a bigger target on Rebecca's back. Russell watched Rebecca move through those 2 weeks like someone preparing for war, methodical and focused and barely sleeping. She still came to the bakery every morning, still worked her shift with that same desperate intensity. But Russell could see the toll it was taking. Fear had carved new hollows in her face, and her hand shook whenever a car lingered too long outside the window. 3 days before they were scheduled to go public, Vincent's people came back. Russell was in the kitchen when he heard Zoe scream, not scared, but furious, high and sharp and full of righteous anger. He dropped what he was holding and ran, flour coating his hands and panic closing his throat. Zoe was standing in the doorway blocking a man in an expensive suit, her small body planted like she could physically hold back whatever threat this stranger represented. Rebecca was pressed against the far wall, every muscle locked in place, her face white as paper. "Get away from my daughter," Russell said, his voice coming out low and dangerous. The man stepped back, raising his hands in a placating gesture that fooled nobody. "I'm just here to deliver a message from Mr. Ashford," he said smoothly. He's very worried about his niece. He wants her to know she can come home anytime, that he only wants what's best for her. The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting, delivered with the confidence of someone who expected to be believed simply because he was wearing an expensive suit. Russell positioned himself between the man and both girls, his body becoming a wall. "Rebecca doesn't want to go home. If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police." The man's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his posture, a coiling tension that suggested violence waiting just beneath the professional surface. "You're making a mistake," he said, looking directly at Russell now. "Mr. Ashford has a very long memory. You really don't want to be on the wrong side of this situation." It was a threat wrapped in courtesy, and Russell felt Zoe's hand slip into his, her fingers gripping tight enough to leave marks. "Then I guess I'm already on the wrong side," Russell said flatly. He pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over the emergency call screen, and the man finally backed toward the door. He paused in the threshold to look at Rebecca one more time. "Your uncle just wants to help you, Rebecca. Stop making this harder than it needs to be." Then he was gone, disappearing into the same black sedan that had been haunting the alley for weeks, and Russell locked the door behind him with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The silence that followed felt fragile, like glass stretched too thin. Zoe was crying quietly, her face pressed against Russell's side, and Rebecca had slid down the wall to sit on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest. Russell wanted to say something comforting, something that would make this okay, but his mouth wouldn't form the words. Vincent had found Rebecca here, in the one place she'd felt safe, and that safety was now compromised in ways Russell didn't know how to fix. "We need to move up the timeline," he said finally, reaching for his phone to call Patricia. "We're going public tomorrow." Patricia agreed immediately, and by that evening, everything was in motion. She'd been cultivating a relationship with a journalist who'd been investigating the Ashford family for months, looking for the story that would crack things open, and Rebecca's testimony would give him everything he needed. They scheduled a press conference for 9 a.m. at Patricia's office, early enough to make the morning news cycle, public enough that Vincent couldn't make her disappear without it looking suspicious. Russell didn't sleep that night, lying in bed thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, all the scenarios where going public made Rebecca more vulnerable instead of less. The press conference was controlled chaos. Rebecca sat at a table between Patricia and Russell, cameras flashing in her face, while reporters shouted questions before she'd even started speaking. Patricia held up a hand for silence, and gradually the room settled into something resembling order. Russell watched Rebecca take a deep breath, her hands folded on the table in front of her, and then she began to speak. She told them everything: her father's suspicious death, the kidnapping attempt, 3 months of hiding, the systematic way Vincent had tried to erase her from her own life while positioning himself to inherit everything. She named names, identified the men who'd followed her, detailed the threats with a clinical precision that made the journalists lean forward with their pens moving frantically. When she finished, the room erupted into questions. But Patricia had prepared for this, steering the conversation toward the legal implications, while deflecting anything too sensational. By noon, every major outlet was running some variation of the headline, "Billionaire Heiress Accuses Uncle of Murder Plot." Vincent released a statement calling Rebecca's claims delusional, offering to pay for psychiatric treatment, positioning himself as the concerned family member trying to help a troubled girl. But the damage was done. Rebecca was visible now, her story public, her allegations on record. Patricia filed for an emergency protection order that evening, requesting that the court remove Vincent as executor and assign an independent trustee to manage the Ashford estate until Rebecca turned 21. The filing was public record, which meant Vincent now had a legal fight on his hands, the kind that would shine lights into corners he'd probably prefer to keep dark. It wasn't a perfect solution. Rebecca was still in danger. Vincent could still try to have her killed. But now, any harm that came to her would immediately focus suspicion on him. The next morning brought a surprise. A woman showed up at the bakery before opening hours, late 50s and impeccably dressed, carrying herself with the kind of authority that made Russell's protective instincts flare. "My name is Helen Ashford," she said, when Russell opened the door. "I'm Rebecca's stepmother. I've been trying to find her for 3 months." Russell's first instinct was to slam the door, to protect Rebecca from anyone connected to the family that had caused her so much pain. But something in Helen's face stopped him. Exhaustion and grief, and something that looked like relief. Russell led Helen to the back of the bakery, where Rebecca was already working, despite everything that had happened yesterday. When Rebecca saw who was standing there, her face went through a cascade of emotions so quickly Russell couldn't track them all. "Helen," she breathed, and the name came out like an accusation and a prayer all at once. "Vincent told me you were dead. He said you died in a car accident in Europe." Helen's carefully composed expression crumbled at that, grief and anger and guilt all breaking through at once. "I've been in Europe dealing with a family emergency," Helen said, her voice cracking. "My sister was dying, and I was with her for the last 3 months. I only got back 2 days ago and saw the news about your press conference. Rebecca, I had no idea what Vincent was doing. I thought you were safe with him while I was gone. If I'd known—" She took a step forward, hands reaching out, and Rebecca flinched back instinctively. Helen stopped immediately, pain flashing across her face. "I failed you," she said simply. "I should have been here, should have protected you. I'm so sorry." Rebecca stared at Helen for a long moment, her expression cycling through emotions too complicated to name. "Why should I trust you?" she asked finally. And Helen didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, she pulled out her phone and opened a file. "Because I've spent the last 2 days compiling evidence against Vincent. Financial records showing irregularities in how he's been managing your father's estate. Communications with his associates that suggest coordination, documentation of everything I could find that proves what he's been doing. It's not enough to convict him yet, but it's enough to support your claims, to make the investigation take you seriously." Rebecca took the phone with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the screen, while hope flickered across her face for the first time since the press conference. When she looked up, tears were streaming down her cheeks, and she handed the phone back to Helen before stepping forward into an embrace that looked like it carried the weight of months of terror finally being acknowledged. "I'm sorry," Helen whispered against Rebecca's hair. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there when you needed me." Rebecca didn't respond with words, just held on tighter. And Russell felt like he was witnessing something private and sacred. Helen asked what happened next, and Russell explained about Patricia, about the emergency hearing to remove Vincent as executor, about the strategy of making Rebecca too visible to kill quietly. Helen nodded, her face settling into determined lines. "I'll testify. I'll go on record with everything I know about Vincent's business practices, about the questions I had regarding Charles's death that were never properly answered. I have resources, money, lawyers, connections. Whatever you need to keep Rebecca safe, I'll provide it. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was more support than they'd had before. The hearing happened a week later. Russell sat in the courtroom next to Zoe, watching Patricia lay out the case with surgical precision. She presented Vincent's financial irregularities, the documentation Helen had provided, testimony from the journalist about the pattern of witnesses who'd changed their stories after talking to Vincent's lawyers. Vincent's team fought back with expert witnesses and character assassinations, painting Rebecca as a mentally unstable girl, making wild accusations, suggesting Helen was motivated by greed, positioning Vincent as the devoted uncle who'd only ever wanted to protect his niece from her own poor judgment. But Patricia had prepared for every angle. She called Russell to testify about the morning Rebecca first appeared at his bakery, about the condition she'd been in, about the way she'd worked every day for weeks with the kind of desperation that suggested someone running for her life. She called the detective Rebecca had first approached, forcing him to admit on record that he'd made a phone call to Vincent's office within minutes of Rebecca's statement, that he couldn't explain why men matching the description of Vincent's known associates had shown up at Rebecca's shelter that same evening. The evidence accumulated like stones in a pile, each piece adding weight until even the judge looked uncomfortable. When Patricia finished, the courtroom fell silent, everyone waiting to see which way the decision would fall. The judge took less than 15 minutes to deliberate before announcing his ruling. Vincent Ashford was being removed as executor. Effective immediately, a neutral third-party trustee would be appointed to manage the estate pending further investigation. And Rebecca Ashford was being placed under court protection with the explicit stipulation that any harm coming to her would trigger an immediate criminal investigation into Vincent and his known associates. It wasn't everything. Vincent wasn't arrested, wasn't charged with anything, still walked out of that courtroom a free man. But it was enough. Rebecca was legally protected now, visible in ways that made her too dangerous to kill quietly, and the Ashford fortune was out of Vincent's direct control. Russell watched Vincent leave the courtroom, his face carefully blank, but his eyes promising retribution, and felt something cold settle in his bones. This wasn't over. Vincent was still out there, still angry, still dangerous. But at least now they had legal protections in place, had created enough paper trail that Rebecca's death would raise immediate red flags. Rebecca moved in with Helen after the hearing, into a house that had security systems and guards and all the protections money could buy. But she still showed up at the bakery every morning for her shift, insisting she needed the normalcy, needed the routine of working with dough and being around Zoe's endless chatter and Russell's steady presence. Russell didn't argue, understanding that sometimes the most normal thing you could do was keep showing up, keep moving forward, even when everything around you felt unstable and uncertain. Zoe adjusted to Rebecca's new circumstances with the flexibility of childhood, treating the whole situation like an adventure rather than a crisis. She started spending weekends at Helen's house, teaching Rebecca how to play card games and bake cookies and all the normal things that Rebecca had missed while she was running for her life. Helen threw herself into being the kind of parent she'd failed to be when it mattered most, attending every court update and therapy session, making sure Rebecca had all the support she needed to start rebuilding her life. The real transformation happened slowly, in the quiet moments between the dramatic ones. Rebecca started to smile more easily as the weeks passed, the careful control loosening as she began to believe that maybe she was actually safe now, that the danger had receded to something manageable. She gained weight, her face filling out until she looked her age instead of like someone who'd been starving and terrified. She took the GED exam she'd missed while hiding and scored high enough that colleges started sending recruitment letters to Helen's house. She even laughed at one of Russell's truly terrible dad jokes, a real laugh that came from her belly and made Zoe crack up too. 6 months after the hearing, Patricia called with news. The police were expanding their investigation into Charles Ashford's death based on new evidence, suggesting the brake failure wasn't mechanical, but sabotage. Vincent had been named as a person of interest, his assets frozen pending the outcome of the investigation. It still wasn't an arrest, wasn't a conviction, but it was progress. The slow grinding of justice finally catching up to a man who'd thought himself untouchable. Rebecca heard the news while she was teaching Zoe how to make French macarons, and when Russell told her, she went very still for a moment, before nodding once and going back to the macarons like nothing had happened. But Russell saw the way her shoulders relaxed, saw the fear that had been living in her eyes finally start to fade. 2 years after that night when Rebecca first appeared asking for expired cake, Russell stood in his bakery at 5 in the morning, preparing for the day's orders with the practiced ease of someone who'd found his rhythm. The business had grown. They'd expanded to 2 locations now, with Rebecca managing the second one and proving she had her father's head for business, combined with a work ethic that made everyone around her want to work harder. She was taking night classes in business management and baking science, building a life that belonged to her rather than one she'd inherited or had thrust upon her by circumstances beyond her control. Helen had stepped back from active management of the Ashford Company to focus on philanthropy and being present in Rebecca's life in all the ways she'd failed to be before. She visited the bakery weekly, had become something like a grandmother to Zoe, had even started dating Patricia in a development that surprised everyone except Zoe, who'd apparently seen it coming from miles away. Vincent's trial for conspiracy to commit murder, embezzlement, and fraud was set to start next month, and Patricia was confident they had enough evidence to convict, though nothing in the legal system was ever certain until the jury came back with their verdict. Zoe burst through the door with Rebecca right behind her, both of them laughing about something Russell had missed, and he felt his chest expand with something that felt suspiciously like joy. His daughter was 10 now, somehow both exactly the same as she'd always been, and completely different, growing up faster than Russell was entirely comfortable with. She'd appointed herself Rebecca's little sister, a title she took extremely seriously, complete with defending Rebecca's honor at school when other kids asked invasive questions about the news stories and the trial. Rebecca had embraced the role with equal seriousness, showing up for every school play and soccer game and science fair like it was the most important event in the world. "Daddy, Rebecca says we can make pain au chocolat today," Zoe announced, already pulling ingredients from the walk-in refrigerator with the kind of confidence that came from spending half her life in this bakery. Russell smiled, watching them work together with the easy familiarity of people who'd chosen to be family instead of having it assigned by biology. This wasn't the life he'd imagined when Carol died, and grief made every day feel like walking through concrete, when the bakery was just a place to put his hands to work, so his mind didn't have time to spiral. But it was a good life, built from pieces that shouldn't have fit together, but somehow did, held together by bread and early mornings and the decision to help someone who needed it. That evening, as Russell was locking up, he found Rebecca standing outside the bakery in the exact spot where she'd first appeared 2 years ago. She'd grown into herself in ways that still surprised him sometimes, confident now, secure in her place in the world, no longer looking over her shoulder every few seconds or flinching at unexpected sounds. But something about her posture suggested she was remembering, tracing the path from that terrified girl begging for expired cake to the woman she'd become. "You okay?" Russell asked, coming to stand beside her, and Rebecca nodded without taking her eyes off the door. "I was just thinking about that night," she said quietly. "When I asked if you had any expired cake, I'd been to a dozen bakeries before yours, you know. Some ignored me completely. Some told me to get lost, One actually called the cops on me." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But you saw me. Not just the mess I looked like, but the person underneath all that fear and dirt. You decided I was worth helping even though I was a stranger who couldn't give you anything in return except more problems." Her voice caught slightly on the last words, and Russell felt his throat tighten with emotion he didn't quite know how to name. "You were never just problems," Russell said firmly. "You were someone who needed help, and I had the ability to provide it. That's not charity. That's just being human." Rebecca turned to look at him then, and her eyes were bright with tears that didn't quite fall. "I'm glad I found your bakery," she said. "I'm glad I found you and Zoe. You gave me my life back." Russell shook his head, because that wasn't quite right, and he needed her to understand the truth of what had happened here. "We didn't give you anything. You fought for your life. You survived. You did the hard work of healing and rebuilding. All we did was stand next to you while you did it." Rebecca smiled, that real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her whole face. "Maybe," she said, "but I wouldn't have made it without you. So thank you for the expired cake and for everything that came after." They stood there in the evening light, the bakery behind them and the city stretching out ahead, and Russell felt something settle into place that had been slightly askew for too long. This was what healing looked like. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the slow accumulation of ordinary moments and small kindnesses that added up to something resembling peace. Inside the bakery, Zoe was waiting impatiently, ready to head home for dinner. She waved through the window with exaggerated gestures that made both Russell and Rebecca laugh, and Rebecca waved back before turning to Russell one last time. "See you tomorrow morning?" she asked, and Russell nodded, because of course she'd be back tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, and all the mornings that followed. They were family now, the kind built from choice and crisis, and the decision to keep showing up for each other even when it was hard, even when it would have been easier to look away. 4:30, Russell confirmed. "Don't be late." The next morning, Rebecca showed up at 4:27 as always, and they worked together in the comfortable silence of people who'd learned each other's rhythms so well that words often felt unnecessary. When the first batch of croissants came out of the oven, golden and perfect, Rebecca pulled one apart and handed half to Russell with a smile that carried the weight of everything they'd been through together. "For expired cake," she said, and Russell laughed, understanding the full circle of it, how something that started with desperation and fear had transformed into this moment of warmth and belonging, into butter and flour and the smell of bread rising in the darkness, into family. Years later, when people asked Rebecca how she survived the worst period of her life, she would tell them about the bakery on Maple Street and the single father who saw past the dirt and fear to recognize her humanity. She would tell them about his daughter, who taught her that family wasn't defined by blood, but by showing up when it mattered. She would tell them about expired cake and early morning shifts and the way healing happens slowly when you're surrounded by people who've decided you're worth protecting. She would tell them about Russell Kane, who proved that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is extend kindness to someone the world has decided doesn't deserve it. And every year, on the anniversary of that first night, Rebecca would show up at the original bakery on Maple Street with Zoe, grown now and studying to be a teacher, carrying her mother's compassion and her father's steady strength. And they would make croissants together in the pre-dawn darkness. They would laugh and get flour everywhere and remember the girl who'd asked for expired cake and the man who'd given her so much more than food. The world kept turning as it always did, carrying them all forward into whatever came next. But in that bakery, in those quiet mornings, when the ovens filled the air with warmth and the smell of bread promised that something good was being created, they'd built proof that kindness mattered, that seeing someone's humanity could save their life, that the decision to help when you could have looked away was never small or insignificant. It wasn't dramatic. It was just expired cake and early mornings, and the choice to be good when the world made it easy to turn away. And that, Rebecca would say, made all the difference.